Thank you for joining the Lakeside Light Podcast. It's light to help you see your way, and a light version of our full televised Sunday services, which you can find on our website at lakesidechurch.org. This audio podcast is a weekly sermon message of intellectual, spiritual, and sometimes humorous nourishment for the road. Enjoy.
Well, God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So I told the children one of my fun facts that I discovered this week, and I'm gonna move into another fun fact that I discovered this week that has truly captured my imagination a bit. Which is that next week, on January 21st, there will be a large celebration in small corners of the world because it will mark the 500th anniversary of what is considered the beginning of the very first act in a movement called the Anabaptist movement. So I'm going to do a little bit of church history for you. I know you love that. And tell you the story of what happened on January 21st in 1525, almost 500 years ago, in Zurich, Switzerland. You may know that around that time, around 1517, Luther posted his 95 Theses on the wall of his church in Germany. And that sort of accidentally sparked a number of things that resulted in this season we now call the Reformation. So within the very first few years of this movement, you had a couple of leaders spring up. Luther himself began writing and leading. But in Switzerland, one of the main leaders to rise up was this guy named Zwingli. Zwingli was a priest and began also writing about theology and the changes that might need to occur. And he settled in Zurich in 1520-ish. So around that time, people began to be incredibly inspired by Zwingli and by this whole movement going on. And so Zwingli invited people to come to Zurich and study with him. And he developed a sort of group of young people who were a part of basically an intensive Bible study. They would read all of these ancient texts and spend time in the New Testament especially, and sort of train to be leaders in the Reformation. Anyway, within that group, a few of these students became incredibly impassioned, and they thought that though Luther and Zwingli and these early reformers were on the right track, they were not taking it far enough. So this early group of what became called the radical reformers began meeting secretly. So they would meet with Zwingli, and then they began meeting on their own secretly. And they had a few ideas that were pushing Zwingli's ideas further that were not well accepted. And the biggest of them, well, maybe not the biggest, the most famous of the ideas was that to be baptized, you first should have a confession of faith, that you would have a believer's baptism instead of an infant baptism. So there was a public debate about this. It became known that they were starting to say these things, and so Zwingli called them out, and the church leaders of Zurich called them out, and a few of these leaders debated Zwingli publicly about whether or not adults could be baptized in believers' baptisms. And Zurich and the church leaders at the time said, no, you can't do that. And within a couple days of that public declaration, a few of these believers gathered together on January 21st, 1525, in the home of one of the main leaders, Felix Manz. So in Felix Manz's house, we have this very first act where I've got the names written on the back of the pew, so they know that I'm cheating. I guess I just called it out, but just so you know, I don't want to get this wrong. George Blaurock asked Conrad Grebel, one of the main leaders in the group, to baptize him. So George Blaurock asked Conrad Grebel to baptize him. Grebel baptizes Blaurock. Blaurock baptizes all of the other people attending there after confessions of faith. And then, as it goes, that was the beginning of the Anabaptist movement. Anabaptist technically means re-Baptist, and it initially was a title that was sort of an insult to them, but they ended up embracing it. So after they do these adult baptisms, within just a few years, each of the men I just named were killed or died. Conrad Grebel went on for the next few months to preach in Germany and France, and then died probably of the plague. But Felix Manz was killed in Zurich a year later, and George Blaurock was killed for his beliefs about 3 years later in Italy. Which really makes you wonder, right? What was so threatening? What was so scary about this idea of believer baptisms, of adult baptism? Why was that such a threat to the people who were working against the Anabaptists? So I wanted to talk today about 3 sort of forms of baptism. We, of course, maybe not of course, we do believe in infant baptism. We come from the line that really Zwingli was a big part of, Luther and then Zwingli, and then Calvin, who affirmed infant baptism. The reason they cared so much about infant baptism in and of itself was this idea of grace, sola gratia. We believe strongly that you can receive God's grace well before you have any idea of what is happening in your own life. That the order of salvation and grace is not you do something and then God responds to what you do, but that God's grace comes first and we respond to it. So in our tradition, we have long and still accept the idea that an infant who has no idea what's happening, that maybe they're screaming during a lessons and carols service, before they have any way of receiving God's grace or responding to it, God's grace is there for them. And so we make promises on their behalf that they will be raised in the faith and that we will consider them a part of our community. But this emphasis on grace is why we baptize people before they can make a statement of faith. The idea that you have to make a statement in order to be saved is what they were pushing against in some ways. So that's one form of baptism, right? This infant baptism idea. But I think it's worth looking again at what inspired these Anabaptists 500 years ago and why they're still so inspiring to so many people now. You may know that their descendants became Mennonites and the Amish. But those initial Anabaptists, what inspired them about the scriptures was this radical idea that Jesus was entirely separate from what they saw in the world. That Jesus was rejecting all of the ways that we have to be part of broken systems. Anabaptists were very vehement that as Christians, you could no longer be part of a state or powers that put people in hierarchies or ruled over one another. They were inspired by this idea that to become a part of the Christian community meant to reject and turn away from, those are words we use in baptism, right? To turn away from all of the brokenness in the world. Anabaptists became in part dangerous because they were pacifists. They refused to fight. And they were dangerous in many ways because they rejected the idea of power structures. They were some of the first to allow women to preach or have equal standing with men, right? So I wonder, as we look at the forms of baptism we have, this idea of grace, sola gratia, the idea that grace comes first, we hold and should hold, and I hold deeply within what our tradition has inherited. But what can we learn from the idea that there is the opportunity to make a decision in your life, to confess faith, and in those confessions, then do something new and different? The Anabaptists believed deeply in this idea of a confession of faith because they wanted to mark this moment where, by accepting Jesus, you became a part of something different than what you saw. The sadness, the grief, the brokenness all around you, that there was this moment where you could be inspired to do something and be something else, and be a part of something else. I think there's much to learn from that. And in our tradition, we certainly do not now have rules against adult or believer baptism like they did back in Zurich. There's something incredibly powerful about that decision-making layer. I'm gonna read. Look at this. I also have written. I don't have this memorized either. So Anna Jans was one of those early Anabaptists, and she was also killed as a martyr. But before she died, she wrote letters to her infant child. And here's one thing she wrote to her child. But where you hear of a poor, simple, cast-off little flock, which is despised and rejected by the world, join them. For where you hear of the cross, there is Christ. Honor the Lord in the works of your hands, and let the light of the gospel shine through you. Love your neighbor, deal with an open, warm heart, your bread to the hungry, clothe the naked, and do not tolerate having two of anything, because there are always those who are in need. In a moment, I'm going to invite us to remember our baptisms, or to imagine a baptism if we haven't had one. And of course, that memory is a shared memory that you may not actually have a physical memory of. But I invite us to remember our baptisms because there is this opportunity again and again to affirm those kinds of things that Jans and Manz and Grebel and Blaurock, I lose all credibility by not remembering how to pronounce his name. But to affirm those things that they believed in so deeply, that we too can hear in the words of Jesus and even in our baptismal vows. So if you're counting, of course, that's two forms of water, right? Infant baptism water and adult baptism water. But there's a third, we're good Trinitarians, that I wanted to bring up, of course, which is this day when we tell the story of how Jesus himself was baptized. In thinking of both infant and adult, any kinds of baptism, of course, we're not just thinking about your individual action or God's grace on you as an individual, but the act of baptism, the symbol of baptism, as a way of uniting us and a way of symbolizing that we are part of a larger story. In Jesus' baptism, we can see that symbol come to the fore in one of the most powerful ways. Because, of course, we do not believe that Jesus needed to be cleansed in order to be perfect or that he needed to wash away a bunch of sin. Instead, we believe that Jesus chose to be immersed in the dirty waters of Jordan as a full articulation of his incarnation. That is to say, in his baptism, Jesus acknowledges that he is a part of the mess that we are all in. The water of baptism symbolizes the ways we could all do better and be better, and the ways the world is not just what we see, that there is better that is out there and it should be better. So Jesus choosing to be baptized is a way of him affirming that he is fully a part of even the brokenness of our world, that he is a part of this brokenness that happens even when you're just a baby, and affirms the idea that every part of our world can use a little bit of grace and can have a little bit of grace. In baptism, we're united in Christ's baptism, and that reminds us that it's not just about whether we as an individual get grace or believe in grace, but that in our baptism, we acknowledge that God already loved all of us and can offer grace throughout the world. So those are our three forms of baptism, or three forms of thinking about water today. And as we move into remembering our baptisms, I invite you to try to remember if you were a part of it. But if you weren't, to reaffirm what it is to truly make a choice to follow Jesus and the ways that might separate you from the world or might mean acknowledging hope beyond what you can see. And I invite you to remember that Jesus was baptized too, and that means we are fully joined with Christ, and that every part of our world can use a little bit of grace, and is promised that. That when God said to Jesus, "You are my beloved, in whom I am well pleased," God speaks to us too, and we are all invited into the newness and grace of the water. May it be so.
The Lakeside Light Podcast is a copyrighted production of Lakeside Presbyterian Church. Visit our website at lakesidechurch.org for more information. Have a great week.